Hi everyone. So my name's Alice Jones. I'm a postdoc here at the University of Adelaide. I'm working on a large collaborative project that involves a lot of South Australian institutes and industry and government members, and also Edith Cowan University in WA. So our project is really looking at the blue carbon resources in South Australia at quite a broad scale. And blue carbon is basically carbon that is sequestered and stored into coastal vegetated habitats. So that's mangroves, salt marsh and seagrass. And these ecosystems, basically the vegetation sequesters carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and then stores it in its biomass, which is above the ground, and also stores it in below ground sediment stores. Because these ecosystems are covered by water either all or some of the time, they're very efficient at sequestering and storing large amounts of carbon for long periods of time, because they're not, they don't get oxygen, the carbon doesn't get oxygenated and it's not then emitted back to the atmosphere. So you can see in some of these pictures up here, there's some really deep carbon stores that can be found underneath these ecosystems. And that basically means that they really punch above their weight in terms of their capacity for carbon storage when they're compared to terrestrial ecosystems. Most of the carbon that's stored in blue carbon habitats is stored below ground in the sediment, but you can see the light blue and the dark blue differentiate the above ground and the below ground. So in terms of the proportions, mangrove has the greatest amount that's stored in the vegetation above ground. So our GOIDA funded project is got three main parts, and as much as I tried to cover everything, I'm only going to be able to concentrate on the first part, because I did practice this talk a few days ago and it was about 22 minutes long, so I had to take out quite a considerable amount of really exciting stuff that I wanted to tell you all about. So I'm just going to focus on the estimates of below ground carbon storage in South Australian ecosystems. The reason that GOIDA and the government and other people are interested in these estimates is because at the moment, most of the estimates about blue carbon storage capacity are from tropical ecosystems, and the appropriateness of applying those values to sort of semi-arid systems and plants that are at the sort of boundary of their ranges. And sometimes, for example, mangroves here, we can find them in dwarf form, etc. So we're not sure that it's actually appropriate to apply those storage estimates to our South Australian systems. In addition to that, we have used some case studies to look at the impacts of degradation and restoration on the carbon storage capacity of ecosystems. And we're about halfway through the project, so mostly we've been doing field work and working up data and doing data processing, and we're just starting to get some results in. So these are preliminary results that I'm going to be showing you today. In terms of managing for carbon storage, so that difference between what is the capacity of a degraded versus a restored or a healthy habitat, this image kind of shows what we're looking at. So on the top, you've got a healthy habitat or a restored habitat with healthy vegetation, a lot of carbon stored in the above ground biomass, and also carbon being actively sequestered and stored into the sediments below. When you have degradation of systems, that might involve physical removal of the vegetation, so you automatically lose your above ground biomass and carbon storage. In addition to that, if there's disturbance of the sediments, then you start losing carbon and other greenhouse gases that have been sequestered into the sediment, and they're getting emitted into the atmosphere. So your system becomes a source of emissions rather than a sink. On top of that, you obviously lose your capacity for future carbon sequestration, because you no longer have a functioning ecosystem which is able to sequester carbon into the future. So what we're trying to get is some values around what those impacts are and whether restoring habitats increases your carbon storage capacity. So we've taken sediment cores at a number of case study sites where we have an impacted site and then a nearby control that we're looking at this effect of impact and restoration. We think of our cores as a type of muddy time capsule, because as the sediment in your core gets lower down, it basically reflects what was happening a longer time ago. So it's buried sediment that used to be at the surface and has now become buried. So you can look at sections through the core and get an idea of what's happened through time at your site. So one of the sort of caveats in terms of looking at core samples is that there's two ways to look at it. You can look at your carbon stocks within a specific depth. So for example here, say we're looking across two cores that are taken at two sites, and we're looking at the carbon that's stored in the top 1 metre of the sediment. So in this case, the one on the left is the, looks like it's going to be the best site in terms of carbon storage. So, oh, sorry, went the wrong way. But then what you need to take account of as well is how long it's taken for that sediment and the carbon to be accumulated in your system. And you can't do that unless you date your cores, so you have an understanding of how quickly the carbon's being sequestered. Once you look at that, you might change your opinion about what's going on at your sites, because the site on the right is accumulating sediment and carbon much more quickly than the site on the left, which basically means that you can get an annual removal of carbon rate, which means that you're really comparing like for like across your sites. In terms of the results that I'm about to show you, we're just looking at the depth, and we haven't yet got the dating for these cores, though that is in process, so we will have that, but not at the moment. In addition to that, some other caveats around the data that I'm going to show you. The carbon is from loss on ignition method, so that's a combustion method which just indicates the amount of organic matter in the samples rather than actually measured carbon. So we are measuring the carbon, but those samples are at the lab and we haven't got the results back yet. I'm also only showing you 1 out of our 3 replicate cores from each of our sites, because we're still in the process of getting all the data together. So we've got 2 seagrass case study sites. One's in Port Broughton, where there was physical disturbance. There was seagrass mining there decades ago, where they physically dug up the seabed and removed the seagrass mat from below the seabed. And we've also got an impacted site at Semaphore, where there was a leaking sewage outfall pipe which caused a reduction in water quality and some loss of seagrass in the localised area. So for each of those 2 sites, we've also got a control, which is a nearby area that hasn't been impacted and is at a similar depth. And what we see is that in our impacted sites, so this one here and this one here, we're seeing much lower organic matter in those sediment cores than we are at the control sites. So we can do some fancy maths, which involves a lot of assumptions, and convert the organic matter values into estimates of carbon stocks. So again, we are measuring the carbon in the cores, we just don't have that result yet, so we're doing this in lieu of having that data. And what that shows for the seagrasses is the same pattern, so our estimated carbon stocks are lower in the impacted sites than they are in the unimpacted sites. The mangroves, we've got Torrens Island as our control mangrove site, so our unimpacted site. And then we're using a site called Mutton Cove, which is in Outer Harbour and has quite a checkered history in terms of the management there. So it used to be in the 40s, it used to be fully mangrove. Then a seawall was built there, which caused the site to become quite dried out, and then there was some restoration in the 90s which restored it to having a controlled tidal flow with some mangrove and mostly salt marsh. And then in the last couple of years that seawall has been breached, and so there's now sort of uncontrolled tidal inundation occurring there. And so we're looking back through time, through the core, to see if we can track all of those different things that happened at the site and see how that affected the carbon storage. So you can see here again, in terms of the organic content, we've got the highest organic content in the control site, and then we have 2 sets of cores from Mutton Cove. There's no significant difference between the control and one of those, but there is with the other one, although the one that's the lowest is in our semi-restored area where there's been 14 years of mangrove regrowth. So we would have expected that to actually have probably more organic matter than this middle one here, where there's not really been any regrowth of mangroves. And also, just to make things even more confusing, when we convert this into our estimates of carbon stocks, the pattern is the opposite direction, and that is to do with the sediment densities. So it seems counterintuitive, and we're definitely going to have to get to the bottom of that using our more sophisticated analyses of actual carbon and dating, so we can look at accumulation. Just a general overview, we're showing that, or we're finding that at our sites, we've got much more carbon being sequestered into the mangroves, like sort of two-fold increase compared to the seagrasses. And that is consistent with global data on differences between these systems in terms of their carbon capacities, carbon storage capacities. And obviously our dating and our elemental analyses that we're running will help to tighten these results up a bit and give us some more robust results. Just briefly going to talk about a student project. So we've got Christina Asinopoulos, who is working collecting surface cores, so just the top 10 centimetres, along transects at 9 sites in South Australia. And these include Torrens Island and Mutton Cove, so our 2 larger case study sites. And her data is showing that there's not, she's just looking in the top 10 centimetres, and again, looking at stock by depth, not dated, so not accumulation rates. But she's finding there's not a great deal of difference in terms of the total carbon, the organic carbon in salt marsh and mangrove ecosystems. There is a small amount of difference, with salt marshes having slightly higher capacity for carbon storage, but they're not all that different, which is quite different to what we see in the kind of global reviews and things, which indicate that mangroves have a higher capacity for carbon storage. So I'm not going to go into any detail about this, but I couldn't bear to just completely exclude it altogether. This is the second part of our project, which is looking more broadly at spatial changes in these ecosystems through the state across time, and also developing methods for measuring above ground biomass and vegetation changes in ecosystems using aerial imaging. So one of the things that we're doing is using the new Dew land cover data set to look at change through time in the likelihood of mangrove and salt marsh presences. So this is just an example of the type of data that we're using, and that's based on Landsat data, and you get 5-year time slices and can look at change through time. And also at Mutton Cove, we're using drones to look at change in vegetation. So you might be able to see in the background here, this is a lot of dead salt marsh at Mutton Cove, where we've got this inundation happening in an uncontrolled way, and a lot of the salt marsh is dying because it's basically being flooded, but there's a lot of mangrove seedlings coming in as well. This is some data that we've got from ARA, from LiDAR, which really neatly, I think, shows this is the seawall, this is Port River on the far right-hand side, and you can really see where those 2 breaks in the seawall are. This is elevation data. And you can see that the water's coming in here, it's causing erosion, and it's flooding into the flatter areas in the reserve there. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.